Los Angeles. In this sprawling city, the night never truly ended. Neon lights bathed the sidewalks, while laughter and music spilled from bar doors, echoing through the streets. But something felt different that night. The city seemed tenser, quieter. Detective James Carter sat outside a small bar in one of the quieter parts of the city, taking a rare break. After 12 years on the force fighting crime, he was a hero to some, but to many he was just another black man in a city where prejudice ran deep. That night he was tired, physically and mentally drained. One hand held a cup of coffee, while the other fidgeted with the worn leather of his jacket. As James sat quietly, he felt invisible among the passing crowd. His eyes wandered into the emptiness of the city. A young couple strolled by on the sidewalk. A group of rowdy drunks stumbled out of the building next door, laughing loudly. James shook his head with a faint smile. This city, chaotic as it was, had become his home. But tonight, this city would remind him just how unjust it could be. Under the yellow glow of a street lamp, a patrol car slowed to a crawl. Inside, 2 officers scanned their surroundings as the radio chatter filled the silence. Patrols were usually uneventful, but that night, one of the officers fixated on James sitting in front of the bar. "Look at that guy sitting over there," the younger officer said. His tone tinged with suspicion. "What's he doing out here this late?" The more experienced officer shrugged. "I don't know. But we can find out." The car came to a halt. One of the officers stepped out. Hearing footsteps approaching, James tensed slightly but remained calm. This wasn't unfamiliar territory for him. As a black man, being seen as suspicious was far too routine. "Hey!" the young officer barked, his tone sharp. "What are you doing here?" James sipped his coffee, maintaining his composure. "Hitting. Is that a problem?" The younger officer smirked mockingly. "Show me some ID. Now." James took a deep breath, trying to keep his patience. "Why? What exactly am I being accused of?" The older officer joined in, his tone less aggressive but still unhelpful. "We just want to know who you are. Seems like a suspicious situation." James furrowed his brow. "Suspicious how? I'm sitting outside a bar. People can't sit anymore." The younger officer's irritation grew. "Look, it's our job to ask questions. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Show us your ID." James set his coffee down, stood up, and looked both officers square in the eyes. "What's the real reason you stopped me? Is it my skin color?" Those words struck a nerve. The younger officer's face flushed with anger. "We gave you an order. Hand over your ID." James felt his patience slipping. What was supposed to be a quiet night had turned into another confrontation fueled by bias. "Oh, you stopped me because of my skin, and now you're treating me like a criminal." A small crowd began to gather, noticing the escalating situation. People stopped and stared, but no one stepped forward. The younger officer took a step closer, his voice rising. "This is your last warning. Show your ID or we'll take you in." James tried to steady his breathing, but the disdain in the young officer's gaze pushed him to the edge. "Listen," James said, his tone calm but firm. "I work to uphold the law in this city. You have no right to treat me like this." The young officer, now visibly enraged, stepped forward and shoved James backward. "That's enough," he shouted. James stumbled but quickly regained his footing. "Don't touch me. I haven't done anything wrong." The older officer tried to defuse the situation, but it was too late. The younger officer pulled out his handcuffs and yelled, "Hands behind your back." "Now." James refused to comply. "Oh, you can't do this to me." The 2 officers moved in together, forcing James to the ground. The crowd watched in shock, some pulling out their phones to record the incident. The officers wrestled James' arms behind his back and cuffed him. The younger officer began searching James' jacket. Then the younger officer's hand stopped. He had pulled something from James' pocket, a badge. His eyes widened in disbelief. This is a detective's badge. The older officer froze when he saw it. The golden letters on the badge read, Detective James Carter. Still lying on the ground, James lifted his head with a bitter smile. What now, officers? The officers exchanged panicked glances. The younger one stammered, This is a misunderstanding. James sat up as the cuffs were removed. Brushing off his clothes, he took a deep breath. A misunderstanding. Or just the result of your prejudice. James pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket. My turn. Let's see your IDs. I'm filing a report on this incident. The older officer stepped forward, trying to reason with him. Look, Detective Carter. Please don't do this. We didn't mean any harm. James cut him off. Didn't mean any harm. While violating my rights as a human being. The younger officer, his voice shaky, added, We didn't know who you were. It was just a suspicion. Tears welled up in James' eyes. Not from weakness but from a mix of anger and heartbreak. I'm a detective and even I'm not immune to this. What happens to someone without a badge? Without protection? Who fights for them? As James stood, he held his badge in his hand, staring at it. That small piece of metal, he realized, didn't represent his humanity, just his role in a flawed system. Without it, his story would have ended very differently. His gaze turned to the crowd that had gathered. Some looked shocked, others furious, and a few helplessly shook their heads. James could feel the heat of their emotions. Anger, frustration, sadness. Many of them had witnessed or experienced this kind of injustice before. But tonight they weren't silent. James turned to address them, holding his badge tightly. You may not know me. My name is Detective James Carter. For 12 years I've worked to protect this city. But tonight you saw what happens when even I, someone in my position, am reduced to nothing more than the color of my skin. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others wiped away tears. This isn't just my story. Every day, in the streets of Los Angeles, thousands of stories like this unfold. People are judged not by their actions, but by their skin, their heritage, their presence. And tonight, I became one of them. A woman stepped forward, her voice trembling. You're right. My son. A few months ago he was stopped by the police for no reason. He still has nightmares. James nodded at her. His voice steady but impassioned. This isn't just an individual issue. It's a societal problem. And we can only fix it if we speak out. Tonight you witnessed one man's rights being violated. But because of my badge, my story doesn't end here. What about those without a badge? Who stands for them? The crowd grew larger. Phones recorded every word. James turned back to the officers, their faces now pale with shame. You, James said, locking eyes with the younger officer. You're part of this system. But being in a broken system doesn't mean you have to perpetuate it. Tonight you did. But you can do better. The younger officer looked down, unable to meet James' gaze. The older one bowed his head silently. James turned back to the crowd, placing his badge back into his pocket. This isn't just my fight, it's ours. If we want justice in this city, in this country, it has to be justice for all of us. Not just the wealthy, the powerful, or those of a certain skin color. Justice for everyone. The crowd erupted into applause. People cheered, hugged one another, and flooded the streets. James felt the weight of his anger and pain lifting, replaced by a spark of hope. That night, the streets of Los Angeles cried out, not just against injustice, but for unity. And for the first time in a long while, James felt like change was possible. This brings us to the end of the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, don't hesitate to like the video and share it with your friends. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell.